Welcome everybody back to another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm Gabe Crane. I'm joined by my co-host Rahul Didwania. And if you enjoy listening to us, please share our podcast with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also join our newsletter, which is linked in the show description to follow along the journey. Today's episode, I think, giving us butterflies in our stomach. We are excited to have Elliot Katz here, who is an expert on male sexuality. And the title of this episode today is Light in Dark Places, Healthy Narratives Around Male Sexuality. And I think this continues in a certain way themes of a podcast episode we had just a few weeks ago with Kawika David Matos around men's work. And I think being a podcast with two male co-hosts, that we sort of, when this topic came up as a possibility, we looked at this as something that we felt was important to do, if a little bit scary. But I do think a real opportunity today and a pleasure to have Elliot with us. With us. But before we bring Elliot on, I guess, Rahul, how are you feeling about this conversation around male sexuality and everything that's associated with it in today's society?
Yeah, we're looking at each other and smiling, Gabe. I think you acknowledged it. Definitely some butterflies, right? As we were even thinking about this episode in advance, I feel like there's a degree of vulnerability that's being called upon for all of us. But just speaking personally, like for me, a topic I don't feel like I've really talked about, even the word sexuality, to like say that out loud in a personal context, and to go into it and talk about it is kind of new. It's certainly not something my family did. It's not something that we did as a friend circle growing up. Maybe talk about it academically or when talking about like art or talking about shows or movies or that kind of a thing, but not really when it comes to talking about ourselves. As part of that, both nervous, feeling the butterflies that you mentioned, Gabe, but also sort of excited just to like cross into that and to grow into that, and trying to also recognize that not going to get it right, whatever that means. There's no such thing probably, but just like, hey, this is a step. Whatever fear there is, whatever shame there is around this topic, also around this idea we've talked about before of like, hey, we're men, you mentioned, right? We're three men now having this conversation. And there's the part of me that believes that that's really important. You have that group, you have that ability to share experiences and build off of that commonality as much as there are differences in each of our experiences. But there's also that shame around that, kind of like, hey, have we earned this space to talk about it? And just the rhetoric that comes around this. And I'm sure we'll get into more of that later. But yeah, I think it's all of those feelings all at once. In a way, to me, this episode is pushing the boundary more than any other one on some of these dimensions, just because of the nature of the topic. So yeah, with that, I mean, again, I'm very much looking forward to it, but I'm curious what stuck out there, Gabe, for you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. Those are some really important points. Those are common experiences that people have around this topic in general when they're thinking about having it, not on a podcast, but in their everyday lives, in their communities. And I brought up a couple important things that I want to touch on. The first is this idea of us as men being here having this conversation, and some of the, I guess, the question or the shame that brings up, or maybe we should have other identities and people present here. And I think that there are many different dimensions to this conversation that involve many different participants from all sorts of different identity backgrounds. And then at the same time, there is an importance sometimes in creating space for conversations between a particular group of people. And in this case, it happens to be us as men. Our talk back from our conversation we had a couple of weeks ago with Kavika, one of the things we felt is that this is awesome. Kavika is amazing. And it was a really special opportunity to get to have him on the show. And as a precursor to listening to this, it might be a nice idea to go back and listen to that episode, which is about the nature of men's work, which Kavika does on Maui. And I'm involved in that work with him here. But at the same time, we also felt that this is such a rich and deep topic, and we spend our time talking about all the different elements of what we feel about it, that we didn't really get a chance to drop deeply into any particular aspect of what it is to do men's work or to be a man. This episode is a kind of natural continuation of that we do actually have a chance to engage more deeply, and that's important. And at the same time, if you are listening to this, it's really important to mention that you do not need to be a man to be getting value from this conversation. There might be some particular value if you're listening to this as a man or a young man. You might want to share this conversation with other men in your life. But at the same time, this is a conversation that's important for everyone. And if you're not a man, I think there's a lot of value to be gained from this conversation as well. And so that's important to frame at the outset. With that said, I've got other thoughts. I'm going to share them for the conversation itself. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest, Elliot Katz. So Elliot is based in Sebastopol, California. He has a background in sociology, men's work, and fusion partner dance. And Elliot brings an awareness and attunement to the dynamics of power, consent, and erotic desire that play out on and off the dance floor. He brings passion, vision, and permission to create containers of safety, exploration, and transformation. He's the co-founder of the Pulse Partner Dance Collective in Sebastopol and founder of Showing Up Trustworthy, which is soon launching programming to help cis hetero men deepen into embodied congruence, attuned to allyship, and erotic nobility. And so before we go further, I just want to say, Elliot, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you on the show. We've been friends for a long time, and this is a great chance for us to reconnect. So welcome, and I'll just put it out to you from the beginning. If you could just lay out for us, why are we talking about this today? What is the deal with male sexuality? Why should that be a topic of a podcast episode? And what's the problem that's going on with that and how that's playing out in our society?
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to have this conversation with both of you. Yeah, what an opening. First question. I mean, I'll start with, you mentioned men's work and men's circles. And for men that have the privilege of sitting with other men, being in spaces of honesty and transparency, still in those circles, in my experience, and I've been involved in men's circles for, call it 14 years, we still too often skip over our inner erotic and sexual lives. It still remains too often. Maybe some circles really have that honesty and safety for men to share that part of their lives. But even within those sacred containers, it's often still taboo and too stigmatized to really expose the shame that we might have, the confusion, the discomfort. It's a place where we too often are supposed to have it all figured out, falls into that man box of masculinity that I'm sure we'll talk about. Most men don't have those spaces. Most men have no place to really expose themselves from their heart, like expose their heart to the places where they are trying to live a fulfilling erotic life. Everyone with a heartbeat wants to have that. And for men, there's a lot going against them. And I'll start by saying that part of the problem is that men are hurting. It feels to me like the start of the issue, where why men are hurting, there's all sorts of individual and personal family constellation issues, whether it's big issues of trauma or just ways that boys and men don't feel safe to be full humans. There's, the social conditioning that boys, it starts as really young boys who don't get to have their emotional expression, are either told deliberately or are symbiotically see the fact that they are not going to be validated as a man or as respectable or as worthy if you express these characteristics of tenderness, of emotionality, reaching for closeness. These things are essentially stripped away from boys and young men. And by the time we become leaning into our sexual lives, looking for erotic connection, our own self-attunement is deeply disturbed. Our connection to our own emotions and our emotional literacy of how we can communicate with partners, how we can bridge a real deep trust and get the healthy consent that we want to have connective and enjoyable experiences with others. These mature human qualities are relegated to anyone that's not a boy or a man. Like, other people get to have those human experiences validated as pure, as sacred, as natural, and men are stripped of that. And that's, to me, what feels like the first abuse that happens. And then from there, from that hurt place, from that constricted, oppressed place, boys and men hurt others, and they hurt others in big ways. And I will say that the hurt that I just described of kind of systemic, traditional, hegemonic, patriarchal, masculine conditioning is one way that all boys are hurt, all men are conditioned by. And then the numbers are high of boys who experience real trauma, whether it's emotional trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma. These are not small numbers. They're lower than girls do and women survivors of, victim to, but the numbers are really high. And so that's another piece that's essentially a silent epidemic of childhood sexual assault that boys experience, right? These are layers where then, men grow up and are high school age, college age, adult, and there is rampant experiences of sexual harassment, stalking, sexual abuse, sexual violence. I've been staring at these numbers. I've been listening to the stories, and we are in this post-Me Too time where male sexuality has been heavily demonized. Male voices are oftentimes silenced. Men's experiences is oftentimes, for right reason, men's voices are become tiresome in the conversation. There's a big ask for men to listen and for men to lean back and let the voices of others come through. And I agree with that. And there needs to be a new way, a new story about the way that men believe about their own erotic energy, around their own life force. These are natural energies in our body, and we are conditioned to experience our sexuality with very limited scope of how we are to pursue fulfillment in our lives. And we can talk all about that. But there's a new story that I want men to live into. There's a new ways that we can get into our bodies and experience our bodies from a healthy expression of eroticism and sexuality, and really offer this preventative education and how we want to frame the conversation around sexuality and eroticism such that men can go after a fulfilling life in a way that doesn't create more and more harm.
Thank you for that overview, Elliot. And just to make sure I'm tracking, right, I think what I heard is there's this problem, right? And it's kind of become a trope, right? This hurt people, right? And this idea that where it's starting, or maybe not exactly starting, but part of the origin is that young boys are not given this space, right, to define what that healthy relationship with erotic energy looks like, among other, I'm sure, other qualities, right, of being a boy or being a man in society. And the part that I think struck me the most is that even the most sacred spaces, at least that you've experienced anecdotally, don't necessarily create the space to have that conversation. That was fascinating to me, that, hey, what we're trying to do here is have that conversation. And, we all acknowledged kind of at the beginning, or at least Gabe and I did, that this is an unusual conversation. Both Gabe and I are in circles, coaches, as practitioners, that really try to facilitate self-understanding, self-expression, dialogue, community around personal growth. And yet still, this was some outside of what was what's clearly within that. And that's striking to me, right? And I think this idea that the hegemonic definition of masculinity, right? It's not a 21st century thing, right? Maybe now we're starting to have this dialogue, but this is a centuries, millennia old societal dynamic, right? Or societal construct. And yes, there are differences across cultures. And yes, there are a handful of matriarchal cultures that maybe operate very differently or whatever, but it's by and large pretty consistent. And maybe we have to define what we're talking about here, but it feels like this idea of the man box of masculinity is an age-old problem. And so I'm curious, if you can speak to that a little bit, like what is this definition of masculinity that we're circling around right now? How does it harm? How does it lead to that hurt, that we're talking about in a little bit more detail? And then what is that suffering? What is that suffering that flows as a result of all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'll start by saying, I really appreciate the courage that you two are modeling here to welcome me in and have this risky conversation. And yeah, I hear the invitation to be in the conversation, not just talk about it, right? And maybe instead of talking about the man box, I'll share how I experience it. How these things are striking to me, because when I read it in a book or I hear people talk about it, it's just kind of like describing the water I'm swimming in. It's like, oh yeah, right. That's exactly how I experience the pressures of, being a man. When I feel validated and when I don't feel validated. Something that was striking for me to recognize is the ways that girls and women are or are not validated. They have their own women box or femininity box that they get to be, beauty standards are so intense. And, the ways that girls have to live into these impossible models. Those pressures I feel like they've been more understood. I feel like the turning towards the way that boys experience a similar but different contortion to fit into certain boxes is less looked at. Now, there was a great movie came out, documentary called The Mask You Live In a few years ago, or a handful of years ago. That was excellent looking at this, and I encourage listeners to go check that out. There's a deep way that men or boys, to start there, are supposed to live into the ideals of masculinity. And I'll say that one thing that feels unique is that boys are consistently having to be validated. There's every day you go to school, every day you step on the sports field, in the locker room, in your, whatever club you're in, whatever friend group you're in, there's this seeking of validation, the seeking of respect that seems kind of like a relentless thing. And I don't know why that happens or how that was created, but the proving that you're, strong enough, tough enough, masculine enough, however that's defined, seems to be this relentless game that every time you have to, you can be stripped of your masculinity on a dime. If you, for what, you could be the strongest guy in the locker room, you could be expected for your athletic prowess. And then if you want to just be exposed, hey, I'm having a really tough time, or man, my parents fighting at home is just so intense for me. I'm struggling there, or I'm having a tough time with my girlfriend, or I'm having a tough time that I don't seem to be, desired by the girls that I'm attracted to. Anything that's vulnerable, you could just be slapped away. It's gruesome the way we feel boys. I feel I had to kind of keep up this mask. Say masks can look like, emotional stoicism. It can look like toughness. It can look like not expressing fear or pain. It can be the kind of do it all on your own and never ask for help story. I feel like that story continues. Men are really not allowed to ask for help. It's a sign of vulnerability. I say these things, they seem, now I'm 38 years old. These seem silly. They seem inhumane to try to live into these ways. And for me, there was this liberation of, what if I just forgot about that story for a minute and reached out for the help I needed, or exposed myself? There's deep healing that I experience by admitting fault, admitting that I don't know how to do this, admitting that I'm confused, admitting that I'm scared of what I'm about to try. And a lot of my own sense of self-love comes from witnessing my own courage in life, witnessing myself stepping through the fear and doing the thing that I want to do. And for men, so it takes a lot of courage to speak vulnerably and honestly about what's happening in our inner lives, and not just to our partners. A lot of the framing of what I've been looking at as a cis heterosexual man comes from a heterosexual frame. So, I just want to say that all men are not heterosexual. Male bodies are not all, identify as men, or really feel they fit into this, man box, or even had this conditioning. So I hope that this conversation doesn't exclude anyone in this conversation. And it feels particularly powerful for me to be in the work with cis heterosexual men because there's a lot of support and a lot of change, a lot of humility that's needed for men that identify that way. So I welcome men who identify that way to the table, to the conversation, because we too often kind of pass along in our dominant culture of not needing to be courageous, be humbled, and get vulnerable and risky with ourselves, with other men, or with kind of on a cultural lens. So yeah, those were a lot of words. I answered some of it. There's a lot more around what the man box is, what those pressures are. But I'll say also there's kind of these caricatures of masculinity, what it means to be powerful. Either you're physically strong, either you're successful in this sexual conquest with women, or you attain certain power and respect, whether it's you have a lot of money, or you're in a position of power. There's others, but those are ways that are like obvious, blunt positions of respect that men are often seeking to get one or all of those pieces to validate themselves. And this validation, this like brick building is, in my experience, made of straw. It just gets blown away so easily. And a solid foundation of self-respect comes from different behaviors and different accomplishments.
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 different threads and questions that like simultaneously want to go down. And I think I'm going to borrow a page from Rahul's book, who often does this. So just ask, he's like, okay, well, there's these threads and I'm going to ask this one and that one. And then you just respond to whatever feels right for you. But, what you're sharing so far is really pinging a number of elements. The first being this juxtaposition that what you just shared, that cis hetero men need support. This is the group that is the privileged group. You mentioned the Me Too movement earlier. This is the group that is the problem. This is who is creating abuse in the world. This is also, if we start expanding it out, this is the group that's created industrialization, created capitalism, is leading the exploitation and destruction of the world. They are the problem. They're the devil. And here I'm hearing you say something the exact opposite, which is that they need support. Actually, they are human. This is obvious, right? But it's something that I think, as you said, a lot of the understandable and necessary elements of the conversation that are happening in our society, this component is often going missing. And so I'm curious if you can comment about that. That's one of my questions, Ron. What sort of support do they need? I think just a couple comments maybe to color that in, and maybe that did focus my question there. But, just thinking about these locker rooms, and of course, locker rooms will always be famous from 2016 forward, right? It's just like we're having locker room talk right now, right? And this is not the kind of conversation that happened, at least in my locker rooms when I was a teenage boy. And you mentioned that silence that takes place around that time, just when all of the hormones of puberty, all of this introduction to the sexualization of our society and the world starts to flow in. And then this silence around the processing. And within that, the entry of these darker and insidious forces and impulses, influences, that kind of take this natural life force energy, this innate natural power of what it is to be alive, and turn it to something darker and eventually, in some cases, violent and problematic. And so that's something sticking out to me. And then lastly, that a lot of these characteristics that you named of these invulnerable men, they're not over there, I'll count myself amongst them, that we come to embody around being emotionally distant or being strong, being powerful. These are actually characteristics that then end up becoming celebrated by our society. So on the one hand, we're kind of talking out of both ends of our mouth as a culture. It's like, on the one hand, we're vilifying and demonizing sexually violent men, but at the same time, we are celebrating these character traits that go hand in hand with those qualities. I mean, you mentioned for women, people who are female identified, I think there's a similar dynamic with beauty. We all talk about how it's this terrible thing. Barbie movie is out right now, offering that commentary on that. that it's not what that's all about. This is a terrible thing. But then we totally celebrate beautiful women and marginalize women that we don't think are as attractive. And so I think there's a similar dynamic going on here. And so, yeah, I guess that most of that's color. I want to come back to, so what is the support that cis hetero men need? What do they need to hear? What do we need to be telling to one another as men? What do we need to be put into practice ourselves to change this dynamic and narrative?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And I'll be in the question with you because, my work is asking that question time and time again, with each encounter, each man. I have some ideas. And I'll say first off that men need a space to be with other men. We need to take some of the pressure off of our partners or our mothers or, women in our lives. We need to be learning in spaces of men for lots of reasons, both to receive attention and support from men, but also be in service and be giving our reflections and being in a space of transparency. It is liberating space. Okay, there's like a landscape here of what support men need, because there's personal work we're talking about. Some need, maybe all humans, but men need, therapeutic support, need a therapist, need somatic embodiment, or, work, need to get over major traumatic things that have happened in our lives. And I invite any man to really take that on for themselves in their lives. It's going to just breed new kind of liberatory opportunities, more options of how you can be. I'll say two different things that happens. One is, there's a lot of like what men shouldn't do. Like, stop it. Stop allowing, there's a thing called bystander training where it's happening on college campuses. If you're seeing your friends start to harass a woman or, God forbid, actually engage in sexual assault, to step in. How do you do that in a way? It takes a lot of courage up against the like bros before hoes culture. I say this like almost like air quoting, but it's like there's something that I feel pain in my body when I say this. These are really gruesome normalcies that are like in boy culture, right? So, gosh, what a low bar it is to reach out to your friend who's harassing or abusing his girlfriend, or a girl that he's approaching that evening or whatever, and saying, hey, something's off here. You're missing something. I don't like what's happening. Doesn't feel right. Can we talk about it? So there's bystander training of like, what could you do to intervene in a situation, to be an ally to the person that feels like they're at the whim of aggressive or hostile. That's right up against just basic consent training of what does consent mean? What does it look like? How can it, there's a learning of how to get beyond the awkwardness of it, and how it can be actually a very enjoyable thing to receive yeses, and then how to really gracefully receive a no. And that's like, I will double down on that practice every day. Like, how can I share a desire that I have? And if that's not reciprocated, how can I really respect and honor that person for their no? That's like deeply healing as a man to know how to do that well. And that's right up against of what I would call shame resilience. When we are told that we're doing something wrong or doesn't feel right, or, hey, that's a interesting invitation, how about we do something else? Or here's another idea, or just flat out, no thanks, not interested, please move on. Whatever the no looked like, to really be, how does a man take that on? What's happening in our body when that happens? And I will time and time again come back to, this life is contained within an organism called our body. And all of our emotional experiences, all of the, the shame, the trauma, the joy, the pleasure, this is contained within our bodies. And the better that we're more familiar with and are able to feel emotional resilience in balancing ourselves when we're struck by, a no or shame or, our own inner self-talk, there's that leads right into a world of emotional literacy that I spoke about earlier, where boys are not offered the ongoing daily practice of recognizing our emotional experience, being able to name that, speak to that in a way that feels clear, congruent, and also is received by the other in a way that can, I honor your experience. I can, I really hear you. I trust you. What support do you need right now? So having spaces where men can build up their emotional literacy and be able to express in a way that feels true and trustworthy for whoever is receiving that. That's a type of support that boys and men need. And the last thing I'll say is, it's touching on, I mentioned the body. This is embodiment practices. So I'm coming from a world where I facilitate and organize partner dances and partner dance events. And it's such a deep practice of consent, intimacy, connection, attunement. And the more that boys can be in not just in their bodies, because most of the times when, the type of connection that men get is either playing a sport or having sex. And too much of men's actual biological need for connection and touch and nurturance is relegated to sexual experiences. And we need to start to build into our lives opportunities for those human needs to be nurtured, to be fulfilled outside of just an erotic moment of sex or penetrative sex. We need to spread out the ways that men can be really seen as, human and have those human needs met. So that's a whole other conversation that, we can talk about. Those are some of the landscape that feels important for men.
Yeah, and I know, Elliot, you just said, hey, that's a whole other conversation, but I think what I just heard in there is what the real need is for this male character that we're talking about, right? It's connection, it's feeling loved, it's being able to express love or express affection, right? And having a context or an environment that supports all of that is what I was just hearing there. And it's interesting, like I was sharing with Gabe before this conversation, I was like, yeah, even something like giving a hug, right? Which is to me my knee-jerk reaction is, oh, that's so innocuous, right? It's just a simple, like sharing of warmth and affection between two people, but I'm like, actually, it's sometimes not that simple, right? And is it okay? Is it, what are the circumstances in which the other person is willing to accept that? Will it get misinterpreted? Is it, going to set off a reaction? Am I going to get vilified for it? These are all also built in. And I think often, the judgment around whether or not something like a hug or anything more than that is appropriate is left to intuition. That judgment is, and if you're generally more socially adept and in tune with these things, you might be by and large, able to navigate that better than others. But that's what I loved actually about what you threw out there as these three things, right? The bystander training, the consent training, shame resilience, sort of as a curriculum to build vocabulary around emotional literacy and to have a toolkit around it and to have models of what good looks like. And I think all of that is so powerful. And then the other thing I was feeling as you were talking about all of that, right, and talking about having spaces, was just even thinking about like my friend circle, right? And some of the, what you mentioned, like bros before hoes, right? I'm like, man, the number of times I heard that, right, back in the day, and didn't just hear it, but I'll say like chanted it, right, almost like represented that energy, and trying to put myself in my body. You mentioned embodiment way back when. There was a part of me then that didn't feel completely connected to that, and yet, and this is, I guess, the power of culture, right? Or the power of environment or the power of the box that we were talking about, right? And yet I would lean into that, right? I would lean into that because it it was the path. It was the path to being viewed a certain way, to having a certain amount of validation. And I don't know that I've ever really said that out loud, right? That, hey, like, I have done things to be validated, or I have presented myself in a certain way to be perceived as attractive or to attract, like females that I was around, or to be, viewed even by my male friends in a certain light, right? I remember years ago there was this conversation between our friends of like, who's the toughest? And I remember within myself subtly jockeying to be considered right among the group as one of the tougher people. And it's like, it's super interesting. It's like, man, like, and I think what this conversation is prompting for me is just examining the tie between actions, between posturing, between even thoughts that I've had, and this desire to be validated, or this erotic energy, this desire to be loved, to be viewed as attractive. And I imagine that list, of these ties is endless. Is like, it's probably almost everything. Like, I think that's why that maybe this topic is so fascinating, right? Is and in particular tying it back to sexuality, in particular tying it back to eroticism, right? Which is this force that I don't even know how to talk about, but I'm like, just right now there's this flood of moments that's cycling through my mind of like, okay, yeah, let me just be honest with myself that I approached a situation in a particular way because I wanted to be viewed a certain way, and because in particular from a sexuality standpoint, I wanted to be viewed as attractive, and I wanted there to be some fruition of that, right? Whether it was someone looking at me a certain way, whether it was someone saying something, whether it was having some sort of physical intimacy. And something that I'm just thinking, I'm like, my group of guy friends, like, we never talk about that. It only comes out in the most traditional, locker room talk versions. And I can only imagine what that's leaving on the table, because it's leading it to be an invisible force in the way that I act, rather than a force that I've actually looked at, I've examined, I've chosen to channel in a certain way, and I've chosen to bring my own values into the mix with it. How can I integrate respect? How can I integrate humility? How can I integrate compassion and love, not conquest, not whatever, not that heightening of self, but actual togetherness. And I even wish this was building towards a question, but I think this is just, I just was feeling this flood of thoughts and memories and feelings. You spoke of embodiment. I felt my body actually get a little bit lighter, just like noticing these things. But then also kind of just this inquiry, I think, popped up of like, man, what are the things that I wish I'd done differently that were tied to this unexamined force? So maybe I'll just pause there rather than even throw out a question, and I'll just leave that out for either of you to react to.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. And maybe I'll pass it to you, Gabe. I'm curious if you want to chime in. I could bounce back, but I'd love to hear your voice.
Yeah, I've got a thought or two on that. First of all, I just appreciate you sharing, Rahul, and like, it's personally resonant. I think most guys who have been in American college or had a group of guy friends who played sports or things like that are probably going to be able to relate to the series of experiences you just shared. And what it brought up for me is actually clarifying this question is kind of bumping around inside me for a minute, which is that, again, with that, I think that we get left with contradiction or contrast that we're faced with as men, where, okay, if I start to question or open up and be vulnerable around some of those dynamics, where the heck does it leave me? It starts to unravel a lot of things. Oh, maybe I shouldn't have acted that way, right? But what is the alternative exactly? And one of the thoughts that popped into my head, to be transparent, as you were sharing that, around this phrase, bros before hoes. Obviously, there's a derogatory component of that phrase, which is messed up. But then there's this also there. It made me think about life stages and life cycles, and that there is this phase in life of bachelorhood where you are kind of with your brothers, so to speak, in a traditional sense. There is some sort of there's some truth in this statement around, like, center around your brothers, your friends, your male friends. Don't get caught up in chasing after a romantic partnership, to kind of try to take out or not even just a romantic partnership, but like sex with a woman, to be more vulgar. But there is some element, like natural human life, embedded in that statement. I was just thinking about famous anthropological academic paper I read in graduate school once about an indigenous tribe using ayahuasca. And in that usage, which takes place in this traditional maloka, or the ceremonial hut, there are like these particular gender roles that each of the parties are playing. First of all, only the men are drinking ayahuasca. Secondly, the women are in the room with them, egging them on, or at least the way the article describes it, egging them on, kind of baiting them with some of their cultural version of some of the stuff we're talking about here, saying that keep drinking more, you're too chicken shit to not drink. What are you scared? Like, go do it. And that somehow there's also this power or importance to that. I think we often, venerate or kind of romanticize indigenous cultures as this kind of wellspring of knowledge or wisdom, or how things are naturally should have been. In this case, I think you'd see that, yeah, right, there are gender roles. There are things that maybe if we were being emotionally vulnerable, some of those men are probably scared shitless sitting there, excuse my language, like sitting there and drinking this drink that's going to totally flip their lid, and feeling pressured as a man to drink it. And somehow there's some value or power in that. And so what it brought up for me is this question. I've heard that shared with when I've talked with Kavika, around men's work. Something about why I like working with Kavika is because something feels very rootsy and male about the experience. So there's something about this kind of the better part of these male characteristics. There's a sense of solidity, a sense of power. And I won't name names, but, he juxtaposed that at one point. We're having a conversation with a group that reached out to him to do some work. I won't get into all the details, but that this group was kind of more from the like new age human potential kind of world of men that are probably more on the scale of opening up about their feelings, of probably pursuing alternative structures to how they're structuring their life in terms of what it means to be in their partnerships, how they envision themselves as husbands, or if they fathers. And this tension that I heard so clearly and personally resonated with inside, between these kind of polarities of like, okay, here's this kind of more traditional way that has some power, and then there's like all these like new ideas, which are kind of, again, from maybe looking at it more from this traditional lens, my viewpoint of like, they're kind of weird. They lead people astray, or like, yes, it's good to open up about your feelings, but at a certain point, it can become kind of overindulgent, or it's just becomes whining, or you're not doing something positive with it. And I think that any man who's interested in engaging in men's work is going to encounter this in some way. So I guess I'm curious, Elliot, if you have what your experience is with that, and if you have any comments about that could kind of help us orient as men, is the, anything, I guess, going to its extremes can represent issues and challenges. And so how do you respond to people who might say that certain forms of men's work maybe are also missing the point? It's like, took everything you just said, or okay, great, let's get more emotionally aware, let's talk about our feelings, and are somehow still bypassing the situation or taking us somewhere that isn't helpful.
Awesome. Yeah. So what comes up for me is how I've been thinking about this recently is I don't want any of the things that I'm working towards or the messages that I'm offering is to take out, the one mask of masculinity and put on a new one. And for me, it's around truth, and for men to give themselves the opportunity to learn who they authentically are. And what I mean by that is, what are you actually feeling right now? I hear you on the self-indulgence and the over-processing and the let me just live in the emotional field and continue to kind of regurgitate this over-processing experience. For me, there's been too much repression for men in their emotional lives. So there's an importance for men to recover the capacity to feel and to know how to identify that. What that allows them is opportunities to choose wisely and offer discernment to how they share themselves in a truthful way. How that comes off is trustable. If you can name how you're feeling, hey, I'm really turned on right now, I'm really excited right now, or I have this desire to know what you want, know how you feel, be able to communicate that's trustable. Both for yourself, like just to be able to recognize there's emotions that men are so pressured to not experience, not express, that they don't even have the feeling anymore. There's deep emotional repression that's happening. And there's just ways that we just know that if we were to share that way or express ourselves, embody that kind of emotion, like it's risky. We're taking a risk both from either men or peers or women. And so for me, it's not about overdoing it. We've just been underdoing it way too far. So for me, it's about pursuing truth and be able to speak honestly about what's going on for you. That authenticity, I'll say, authenticity begets authenticity. It feels relieving. It feels courageous to speak honestly. If there was just a blanketed way that men behave, it's dishonestly. We lie and we lie and then we lie about our lies, and we are just picking up the pieces. And it was years ago, I have had some friends who I kind of discovered were chronically lying to me and to others. At some point, I don't know if it was years of high school. I think it was probably the end of high school, maybe the beginning of college. I just put a stick in the ground. I was like, I'm just going to stop lying. Like as much as I can. Like, if it's a situation of life and death, it's a different kind of thing. But in my life, I'm going to stop lying. And life becomes riskier, but it becomes lighter. Like there's more buoyancy when I'm not tracking all the lies I laid down and make sure that the next thing I say isn't going to bounce off and cross wires and get myself stuck. And this person knows me as this way, but this person, it's like, holy hell, that's a lot of energy in a game of inauthenticity. So when we can just say we're not going to be dishonest in our life, we want to walk a path of truth, and that's not always simple. Well, I'll say that's simple. It's not always easy for us to be in the practice of that and have the risky conversations that need to be had to share. I mean, for me, when I was growing up, I didn't have any girlfriends in high school. I was really hungry for sexual experiences in high school. And I was terrified of being rejected. I was terrifying of letting someone know that I had a crush on them, or I was attracted to them, or I wanted to be close with them. I had no way, there was no vocabulary that fit in my mouth such that I could express that in a way that felt like lovely, like to share my delight, to share my interest in a way that feels that I'm not like hitting on them or, like just out to like get some. It was, now we're talking like body count. It's like, we're in a pretty shitty place to be, this level of objectification around sexual conquest. But it's also inauthentic to deny the fact that I wanted to have sex. I wanted to have sexual contact. I wanted to have experiences. And so for me, it's like, how do we teach boys to be vulnerable, to be honest? That honesty comes across as trustworthy. There's a safety in just actually for women to feel men where they're at, to hear them speak clearly and have that congruence about how they're acting, how they, the feeling they have in their body and what they're saying. And a woman can really trust that, can really sense, like, if you're saying something and you're not in congruence with what's real, like that's like the creepy vibe. Like, I don't actually fully believe what I'm hearing. And I have to like be in this whole game of discernment of what's real here. I also am like, I want to be a champion for men to have like as much sexually fulfilling experiences as they want. I do not want a bunch of men hiding their sexual charge. That's actually the reason I'm even doing any of this stuff, is like, I wanted easier pathways to having a fulfilling life in this way. And so I don't want men to be shearing off and, masculine, basically shearing off their sexual desire. From my experience, women want passionate men. How do we do that outside of this game of just pure objectifying sexual conquest? How do we like connect like the energy that gets lodged in our cock and our brain and our stimuli with like an allyship, a heartful respect? And to come from a place of like, I really want to create a joyful experience for me and for you. What could that look like? What do you desire? How can we find a place that feels really joyful? And I don't want to make any move that feels like it's crossing you in a way that makes you uncomfortable or is, out of integrity for yourself. So let's find that path. And, for me to really be open and receptive to feedback, recognizing consent is in the moment and we can always retract consent for a given activity. Being in that game of finding pleasure in ways that can feel really damn good in my body, walking away feeling like I got to have, connection, I got to have closeness, I got to have pleasure, and I got to offer myself as a gift. And I want to like slow it down for a moment and say, the story that I want to be part of changing for boys and for men is really going up against this kind of peace mode, Me Too demonization of male sexuality. It's like, how can we embody behavior that is viewing our life force, our erotic charge, our desirous self from a place of reverence, from like in the spirit of beauty. I want to offer myself as a gift. That is a very different story than what we're fed. And what does it look like, as a boy moving into, his adulthood, or men in their lives, dating or in marriage or in a relationship? What does it mean to give myself as a gift, to give my touch as a gift, to, and I'm not one that just kind of like drifts off into the ethereal spiritual realm around sexuality. For me, it's like, what is the practical ways that I can offer, myself honestly, trust in a trusting way, where we're both after like mutuality and reciprocity and pleasure, so that we can feel like we are carrying with us this spirit of beauty and reverence for, not just for ourselves, not just for our own pleasure, but actually for community. Like, how are we building trust in community and walking as an ally for the women, the sisters in our lives? Our personal pursuit is a political act. And how do we take responsibility for ourselves and how we're behaving both in private and public spaces around, carrying our life force energy?
Elliot, I heard in there so many answers to the question that I'd been holding on to for a little bit, which is, what does that healthy relationship with our erotic energy look like? Right. And I think you shaped it in a lot of different ways. I heard ideas of just now responsibility, reverence, celebration, authenticity, and also, not shying away from it, not running away from it, but actually channeling it in a way that's respectful, as well. And in a dance, I know you're in dance, but it's like in a dance with the people that you're coming into contact with. And I think that image, is really powerful as a set of principles and as sort of a way of envisioning what that looks like. And I'd love to actually get into what you were alluding to, right? Which is how do we get there, right? And it sounded like the first step in all of that I heard in what you were saying is being in touch with ourselves and understanding when that energy is present, what that energy wants, being able to articulate it not just externally but first to ourselves, right? Like, this is what's happening, this is what I'm feeling, this is, I guess, what my desire is around a particular situation or an interaction or a moment. And kind of, it felt to me like there's a whole set of things there, between self-understanding, I imagine also self-regulation, and then the piece that I feel like always challenges that, right? And bringing it specifically, because that I imagine is universal, but specifically bringing it to the male experience, I think the part that bastardizes that process, right, is the risk you were alluding to, right? Is the posturing, is the, hey, if I go out and do this and I get, if I get rejected, right? That shame resilience piece you were talking about earlier. Oh, that's going to bring my entire world crashing down, right? And that fear is like very visceral, right? Going back to the embodiment there, like you feel tension, you feel fear, you're not able to, we have all these images of the nervous guy, on a TV show who's not even able to like speak, like make basic conversation or say words to an attractive female or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that is a very relatable experience, at some stage of life for most men who, cis hetero men, right? And it's like, yeah, like that's a lot to process. And so what I hear is an aspiration for what good looks like. My question then is, how do we build that self-awareness? How do we develop that ability to articulate and express what those desires are, and do so in a way that is recognizing the risk and the cultural pressures that might take us away from doing all of that in a healthy manner? What are the tools, I guess, that you work off of or recommend, or the practices, that help people get towards that?
Yeah. I'll say that is another leading question that I'm carrying. Like, how do I, there's no one size fit all here, right? And men are going to have different natural capacities, natural attunement. Just to say, I think that, there's studies that show that young boys are actually more emotional or have more emotional attunement than, again, I don't know, I can't quote the study, but boys have emotionality, boys are human. And to answer your question, there's, are we talking about adults? Are we talking about boys? There's some of that. My goal is to be part of, big collaborations and partnerships this is a multi-generational process here, where we can grant spaces for boys right now. Now, I'm a father. I have a 4-year-old girl. The work that I'm doing right now, God willing, by the time, a decade from now, when she's heading off to high school, that there's going to be a different culture that she gets to be a part of around, eroticism and sexuality. That would be very fast. How about 30 years, 40 years, 60 years from now, assuming we all make it there as a species, that very different way that we are, validating each other and supporting the human authenticity of each individual. So that being said, there's really cool programs and education curriculum for, starting young around self-autonomy of our bodies. How can we get good with our yeses and nos with others, starting in grade school, moving into high school, really getting clear on communicate, consent, and, find those moments of reciprocity with partners. And for the men listening here, I would say that I guess I'll start here. I want men to be able to take an honest look at the impact that they're having in their lives, both on themselves. What is the self-talk? What are the stories that they're feeding? What are they kind of enacting out of where they feel insecure in themselves. Where are we holding shame in our bodies? Where are we holding confusion? Or, where do we know we really went wrong in the past? And how do we make amends for those? Like, how do we clean up where we're starting from right now? This past week, I was actually at the National Sexual Assault Conference, and I was consistently brought back to like those little moments in high school, in college, in my adult life where I didn't show up well. I hurt someone, or my actions actually cast a stone of rippling harm through a community. I think that men can start there of like, how can I own what I know to be true? And I lied to you here. I crossed your boundary there. Let me create a space for an apology. Let me first see if this person's open for an apology, and if so, like, how can I really honor myself and this person by owning up, being responsible, and showing yourself and others of how you're going to prevent that kind of behavior moving forward. I think that simplest thing is, who are your closest guy friends that you can deepen into vulnerability with around your sexual life? I'm in a marriage right now. I'm in an open marriage right now, and I'm a parent, and we co-parent our 4-year-old. There's a lot of moving pieces just in that, of how to be true to what I need, what I want, how to speak that, how to be in relationship with my wife around those pieces. So I would just say, like, take stock of where you're at right now, and how can we build more self-trust into our life right now. And what that's going to do for me is I'm going to be able to respect myself more tomorrow after I have that conversation. And from that greater self-respect and honoring myself for the courage it took to own that, take responsibility for that action, I can make new choices. So that feels like a great starting point. I would also say, specifically around eroticism, a lot of times, both from exposure to porn, from the ways that, we're kind of taught to be dogs on pursuit of sex, be available for sex whenever we want, supposed to perform a certain way, last as long as we can, that sex is entirely, the sexual encounter ends when men orgasm. All of these things kind of shape our ideas of what it means to have a successful, fulfilling, erotic moment, right? There's work in unpacking those pieces. There's work in unpacking what capacity we have for pleasure in our bodies. But a lot of the attention that I have right now is like not around sex, not around flirting or dating. It's like one step back around what happens in our bodies when we get turned on. So a lot of times, I'll just be real honest, the ways that I will masturbate in my life, it's rarely because I'm so turned on, I want to have sex, that I need to masturbate. I'm actually frustrated, or I'm anxious, or I just feel tense. Like I have to do something that I don't want to do, and I'm annoyed about it. And so there's tension. It's like this tension release valve that oftentimes men turn to. There is other ways that men need to incorporate embodiment practices outside of self-pleasure, of how to like you said, self-regulate. That was actually the word I was looking for earlier. How do we self-regulate ourselves in other ways beyond ejaculation? I could list off exercise and qigong and breath work and this and that. I want to invite men to find the ways that they can build up practices of self-regulation. Some of that is relationships with other men. Some of that's just if it's a family member, if it's a best friend, if it's a mentor, if it's your partner. Ideally not leaning too heavily on your partner, but find those people that you can actually find self-regulation with. And, there's also, sexual mastery practices like microcosmic orbit, where there's, you're breathing and you're visualizing and you're squeezing PC muscles here and, basically moving energy out from your groin and, enjoying the pleasure of kind of energetic movement through your body. These are specific practices that men can look into and explore. But for me, it's a wider experience of, emotional self-regulation, physical embodiment, kind of all in the spirit of showing up aligned with ourselves, showing up in a way where we feel that we can respect ourselves and respect others, that we can be on purpose in our lives, that we can go after the things that are really important. And hopefully for me, that looks like humility. It looks like allyship. It looks like respect. It looks like service. And, service can look like whatever it is for you, like find that. I too often see men that are not seeking that are not in alignment with what service means for you. And I'll say that, service is a way that for me, I can like find my groove of integrity and authenticity. And it feels really damn good to be in that space, to be in that spot. And, and I can't tell anyone what their service is in this life, but part of that comes from I'm gonna be responsible for my erotic charge, for my erotic fulfillment, and build the tools around me, both the communication and the emotion, but also the humans that love me, that want to uplift me, and that are there to hold me accountable and question me and mirror back to me by behavior so that I can make amends when I need to and stay true to myself along the path.
Awesome, Elliot. Well, thank you so much for all of that. Just like so many different things that I think can be helpful starting points for people. And yeah, I don't know how you're feeling, Rahul. I think we've been successful in going a layer deeper today. There are so many layers, right? So, I mean, things you just mentioned there at the end, Elliot, of like, I'm like, okay, well, right, we should just do like a whole nother episode just on a lot of those things. And, and I think that's always going to be the case because whether it's, around a range of different topics we talk about on this show, but there's always going to be more to go into. And so we have run out of time for today. But what I guess I would like to invite folks listening to this, if you've joined us this far, is to really be thinking for a moment now of just where is the application for this in your own life? Elliot shared a bunch of different things. You can go back and listen again. There was layers there that were shared of specific tools, specific things that you can do, especially if you are a man and considering this conversation. I want to put it out again to reach out to us. We're always available here at live@wovenwings.net. You can reach out to us. Let us know how this conversation is moving inside you. We'll do what we can to continue that conversation for you, help you get connected with communities or people in your area that might be doing similar work. And then broader than that, whether you're a man or not listening to this conversation, I just really want to invite you to think about less in a broad strokes or this technique or I can use this thing, but who's someone that comes to your mind right now that needs to hear this conversation? Who's someone that you can take that extra moment to just check in with and see how they're doing and reach that hand out to make a connection. These stories that Elliot's leading us through, the change process around, they run very, very deep. And so there's no one out there, none of us part of this conversation are unable to find someone right around us and and ourselves first and foremost that are affected by the dynamics that we've explored today. So yeah, how can grace, how can love make a difference in your life and the lives of the people around you today? Elliot, thank you again so much for joining us today. It's been really a pleasure having you on the show. And as we often say with our guests, I really think that there could be plenty more. So consider the possibility of joining us again. I hope you will.
This was a treat. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Again, please leave us a review. You can follow along by joining our newsletter. More information about Elliot is shared in our show description if you want to get connected more with the work that he is doing. And again, thank you so much for joining us for another episode, and we will see you next time. Aloha and take care.